Earl had worked at the downtown parking garage for 20 years, a quiet man nobody paid attention to. He'd park cars, collect fees, and go home, until the military convoy arrived for training exercises. When the young tank commander approached Earl looking for parking space, he asked, "How do you know these tanks?" Earl touched the armored hull like greeting an old friend. "Because I was one of the first commanders of this type of tank. Gulf War, 1991. Before we begin this powerful story of forgotten armor and brotherhood that transcends time, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who served on steel and sand. Downtown Portland's municipal parking structure was 6 levels of concrete and fluorescent lights, the kind of place where people hurried through without making eye contact. It served the business district efficiently, quietly, like most infrastructure that made city life possible without anyone thinking about it much. Earl Hutchinson had been working there for 20 years, ever since the city had offered him the job after a brief interview that focused more on reliability than credentials. At 68, he was the kind of employee municipal managers valued, punctual, honest, and uninterested in office politics or advancement. He showed up at 7 a.m., processed parking fees until 4 p.m., and went home to a small apartment where he lived alone with his memories. The job suited Earl perfectly. He could work independently, interact with people briefly and pleasantly, and spend most of his day in the quiet company of cars and concrete. The work required no explanations about his past, no discussions of where he'd been or what he'd done before arriving in Portland with a pension and a desire for anonymity. Most customers saw Earl as part of the furniture, a polite older man who took their money, handed them receipts and wished them a good day. He knew the regular commuters by sight, remembered which ones preferred exact change and which ones always tipped, but personal conversations were rare and brief. What they didn't know was that Earl's hands, steady and careful as they operated the payment machine, had once guided 68 tons of armor across foreign deserts. What they didn't know was that the quiet man who helped them park their sedans had commanded crews of 4 men through battles that changed the shape of nations. And what they didn't know was that every rumble of heavy traffic reminded Earl of engines far more powerful than anything navigating Portland's city streets. Earl had built his post-military life with deliberate simplicity. The job at the parking garage provided enough income to supplement his army pension. His apartment was within walking distance of work. He had no social media accounts, no website, no digital footprint that might connect his current identity to his service record. He'd learned to find satisfaction in small routines, predictable days, and the absence of life or death decisions. Tuesday morning started like any other. Earl arrived 15 minutes early, unlocked the attendant booth, and began his first rounds through the garage. He checked for overnight parking violations, noted any maintenance issues, and prepared for the steady stream of downtown workers who would fill the structure by 9 a.m. At 8:30, the first rumble reached him through the concrete walls. Earl paused in his ticket counting, head tilted slightly. The sound was distinct from normal traffic, deeper, more rhythmic, the mechanical heartbeat of heavy diesel engines under load. He'd heard that sound thousands of times before, in places where it meant something very different than it would in downtown Portland. The rumbling grew louder, accompanied by the distinctive clatter of tracked vehicles on asphalt. Earl moved to the street-level entrance of the garage, drawn by recognition that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to muscle memory. The convoy appeared around the corner like something from another world. 12 M1 Abrams main battle tanks, 6 Bradley fighting vehicles, and a collection of support vehicles stretched down 3rd Avenue in precise formation. The massive machines moved with surprising grace, their 68-ton bulk handled by crews who understood the relationship between power and precision. Earl stood at the entrance to his parking garage and watched $500 million worth of America's finest armor roll past. For most people, it would have been an impressive but abstract display of military might. For Earl, it was like watching old friends parade by Falvey, friends he'd lived with, fought beside, and trusted with his life. The lead tank pulled to the curb near the garage entrance, its engine settling into an idle that Earl could feel in his chest. The commander's hatch opened, and a young officer emerged, a captain, maybe 28 years old, with the confident bearing of someone who'd earned his position through competence rather than connections. "Excuse me, sir," the captain called to Earl. "We're looking for parking for our support vehicles. Would your facility be able to accommodate military trucks?" Earl looked past the captain to the tank beneath him. An M1 SAP V3, latest modification, equipped with trophy active protection system and enhanced armor packages. The thermal sight housing had been updated since Earl's time, and the communication equipment was more sophisticated, but the essential character of the machine was unchanged. "That's a beautiful tank, Captain," Earl said, stepping closer.
The captain followed Earl's gaze, noting how the older man's eyes moved over the vehicle with familiar recognition. "You know tanks, sir?" Earl reached out and touched the armored hull, his weathered fingers tracing the reactive armor tiles with the confidence of someone who understood their purpose and placement. The steel was warm from the engine heat, textured with the same surface patterns he remembered from countless maintenance sessions in the desert. "I should," Earl said quietly. "I was one of the first commanders of this type. Gulf War 1991. The captain's expression shifted immediately. The casual politeness of a young officer dealing with a civilian was replaced by something deeper, recognition of shared experience across a gap of decades and rank. "Sir, you commanded Abrams in Desert Storm, 1st Armored Division, 1st Battalion, 37th Armor. We crossed the berm on February 24th and didn't stop until we reached the Euphrates." The captain stepped down from his tank, suddenly aware that he was talking to someone whose experience with these machines predated his own birth. "What was your call sign?" "Steel Thunder 26, Company Commander." The captain's radio crackled with communications from other vehicles in the convoy, but he ignored it. Standing before him was a piece of living history, a connection to the legendary tank battles that had established the M1 Abrams as the finest main battle tank in the world. "Sir, would you—" Earl's careful composure slipped for just a moment, revealing something that might have been longing. 20 years of civilian life hadn't erased the bond between a tank commander and his steel. "I wouldn't want to interfere with your mission, Captain." "Captain Rodriguez," the young officer introduced himself. "And this would be an honor, sir. We're actually conducting urban warfare training exercises this week. Having input from someone with your experience would be invaluable." What followed was a conversation that bridged 2 generations of armored warfare. Earl moved around the tank with the fluid confidence of someone who knew every system, every vulnerability, every strength of the machine. His questions about the new thermal imaging systems revealed an understanding of tank gunnery that impressed the entire crew. "The fire control system integration is remarkable," Earl observed, examining the gunner's station. "We had to manually input range and wind corrections. This computer does atmospheric calculations automatically." "Yes, sir. Cuts engagement time by about 40% over the original systems." Earl nodded, but his expression suggested mixed feelings about technological advancement. Speed's important, but so is the crew's understanding of what the computer's doing. "In the desert, we lost communication with headquarters for 6 hours. Had to fight 3 engagements, using manual calculations and dead reckoning navigation." Rodriguez leaned forward, recognizing a teaching moment. "How did you manage fire missions without digital coordination? Old-fashioned way, map, compass, and crew communication. Your gunner calls out targets, your loader confirms ammunition type, your driver keeps you positioned for the next engagement. Technology's wonderful when it works, but the crew is what wins battles." Other members of the convoy had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual sight of their captain in deep technical discussion with a parking garage attendant. Word spread quickly through the formation that they were talking to a Desert Storm veteran, someone who'd commanded these same vehicles in actual combat. Sergeant First Class Williams, Rodriguez's gunner, approached with obvious curiosity. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what was it like? The tank battles in Iraq?" Earl considered the question carefully. He'd spent 20 years avoiding discussions about the war, deflecting curiosity with polite changes of subject. But surrounded by these young soldiers, standing beside machines he'd once trusted with his life, the old barriers seemed less important. "Terrifying and boring at the same time," he said finally. "Hours of movement across empty desert, then 30 seconds of the most intense violence you can imagine." The Iraqis had good equipment, T-72s, T-55s, but they hadn't trained for the kind of long-range engagements these tanks were designed for. "What was the longest shot you made?" 3,800 meters. Iraqi T-72 hull down behind a berm, 1 round, center mass. The thermal sight made it possible to identify and engage targets at ranges they couldn't even see us. The soldiers exchanged glances. They'd trained for similar engagements, but knowing that the quiet man from the parking garage had actually performed them in combat added weight to the theoretical. "Sir," Rodriguez said, "we're conducting gunnery exercises at the training center this afternoon. Would you consider joining us as an observer? I think my crew could learn a lot from your experience." Earl felt something stir that he'd kept buried for 2 decades. The old excitement of working with a crew, the satisfaction of training young soldiers, the pride that came from passing on hard-won knowledge to the next generation. "I'm supposed to work until 4, he said. "I think we can arrange something with your supervisor." An hour later, Earl sat in the commander's position of an M1A2 for the first time in 20 years. The seat felt familiar despite the technological improvements, the controls responding to muscle memory that had never quite faded. Rodriguez rode as gunner, allowing Earl to direct the crew through practice engagements against simulated targets. "Target tank, 12 o'clock, range 2,200 meters, Earl called out, his voice carrying the authority of experience. "Identified," Rodriguez responded. "Sabot, tank, up," called the loader. "Fire." The 120mm smoothbore gun spoke with the voice Earl remembered, a sharp crack that you felt as much as heard, followed by the mechanical precision of the autoloader cycling the next round. 20 years collapsed into nothing as Earl guided the crew through engagement after engagement, their gunnery improving visibly under his instruction. "How did you know to position us here?" Rodriguez asked after they'd successfully engaged 6 targets from a hull-down position behind a ridge. "Terrain reading. You always want the high ground if you can get it, but more importantly, you want escape routes. See that draw to our left? If we take fire from multiple directions, we can back down that slope and reposition behind the hill mass. They don't teach that level of tactical thinking in basic gunnery school, because it can't be taught from books. You learn it by making mistakes and living long enough to remember them." As the afternoon wore on, word of the unusual training session spread through the base. Other crews requested opportunities to work with the former tank commander, and Earl found himself moving from vehicle to vehicle, sharing insights about crew coordination, battlefield awareness, and the countless small details that separated competent tankers from exceptional ones. "The machine's just steel and electronics," he told one young crew. "What makes it deadly is 4 men working together so smoothly they think like one person. Your driver's got to anticipate where the gunner needs to be positioned. Your loader's got to know what ammunition the situation requires before the gunner calls for it, and the commander's got to see the whole battlefield while keeping track of his individual crew." At 1700 hours, the exercise concluded. Earl climbed down from the last tank he'd instructed, his coveralls dusty and his face carrying an expression of satisfaction that his co-workers at the parking garage had never seen. Rodriguez approached him as the crews secured their vehicles for transport back to base. "Sir, I have to ask, why are you working at a parking garage? With your experience, you could be training crews professionally, consulting with manufacturers, working with the National Guard." Earl watched the sun setting behind the training center's hills, painting the desert landscape in shades that reminded him of other deserts, other sunsets, other times when steel and sand had defined his world. "Captain, I spent 30 years in armor. I loved every minute of it, but when I retired I wanted something different, something simple and quiet, where the biggest decision was whether to validate someone's parking ticket. But doesn't this feel like home?" Earl touched the warm steel of the tank beside them. "It does, but home isn't always the place you need to be. Sometimes you need distance from the things you love most, just to remember why you love them. Will you come back? We could arrange regular training sessions, unofficial consulting." Earl smiled, and for the first time in 20 years, it was the smile of a tank commander who'd found his crew. "Captain, you've got my phone number now. When you need someone who remembers what these machines were like when they were young, give me a call." The convoy departed the training center at 1800 hours, but Earl remained for another 30 minutes, standing alone beside the range where he'd spent the afternoon. The desert was quiet except for the wind, and for a moment he could almost hear the ghosts of engines from conflicts past. When he finally returned to town, Earl drove past the parking garage where he'd worked for 20 years. Tomorrow he'd be back at his booth, collecting fees and handing out receipts, but something fundamental had changed. The careful separation between his military past and civilian present had blurred, allowing him to be both the quiet parking attendant and the tank commander he'd always been. 3 weeks later, Earl received a call from Captain Rodriguez. The battalion was conducting live-fire exercises, and they wanted him to observe their gunnery qualification. A month after that, the National Guard unit requested his assistance with a training weekend. By the end of the year, Earl had become an unofficial but highly valued advisor to 3 different armored units in the Pacific Northwest. He kept his job at the parking garage, but now his afternoons belonged to steel and sand once again. The quiet man who collected parking fees had found a way to bridge his 2 lives, serving his community during the day and sharing his knowledge with the next generation of warriors in the evening. Some soldiers never really retire, they just find new ways to serve. Earl Hutchinson had discovered that the skills learned in desert battles had applications in downtown parking garages, and that the leadership developed over 3 decades of armored warfare could still teach young crews the difference between good gunnery and great gunnery. In the end, it wasn't about the technology or the tactics. It was about the connection between generations of soldiers, the passing of knowledge from those who'd proven themselves in combat to those who might someday face the same tests. It was about understanding that service takes many forms, and sometimes the most important battles are fought in training centers where young warriors learn to trust their steel and each other. Standing in his parking booth on quiet Tuesday mornings, Earl could sometimes hear the distant rumble of tank engines from the National Guard armory across town. The sound no longer filled him with melancholy for what he'd left behind. Instead, it reminded him that some things, courage, competence, and the bond between soldiers, never really end. They just find new places to grow. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of hidden heroes. You never know which ordinary person might have an extraordinary past.